All right. So this is a topic that I think almost every competitor can understand, and that is that even first-time competitors, that once you've been lean for stage, it's far more difficult to become comfortable once again with not being lean. And your definition of what lean is significantly changes. And typically, competitors have a pretty big emotional struggle once they transition back to the off season and have to try to become comfortable in their own skin. This is also compounded by all kinds of stuff that we've talked about on the 3DMJ podcast before, like the recovery diet or reverse diet and the pressure to be lean and the utility of social media to kind of get yourself out there as an athlete or as a coach, and also feeling like you have to look the part of a bodybuilder, an athlete identity, and all kinds of crazy crapola. Something that we've dealt with our athletes all the time. And being a bodybuilding coach is maybe, I don't know, 30% adjusting macros and training and thinking about how many weeks you have left till you get on stage and teaching posing and all that good stuff. And probably 70% helping them not lose their absolute flipping mind in the process and to have an unhealthy relationship with the sport. So anyway, I'm here with Coach Brad Loomis and Coach Jeff Alberts and our silent but amazing producer of sorts, Andrew Valdez. Yeah, we're just going to talk about how we do this, I guess both as athletes ourselves, because I know we've all struggled with this, and also how we do it with our own athletes. So Brad, Jeff, either one of you guys want to start?
I'll just start out by saying that I've pretty much done a 180 when it comes to off season. And I think probably the most convincing thing was a lot of the fine evidence that, kind of you and your associates have put out there, Eric, on how more productive you are at building muscle when you are gaining weight and when you are in a surplus. And, it's never a nice thing to admit that you've been wrong, but at the same time, it is what it is. You're only going to prolong your misguided and unknowingly poor advice if you don't, basically change your mind and do what you know. It's kind of like I always say, if I was a referee in a football game, you got to make the right call. You got to do what you saw, and you got to do the honest thing, And it's kind of the same thing here. It's kind of like, what? I haven't been doing things the best way, with our off-season athletes, and it's pretty convincing that I needed to shift gears and do a 180.
So you mean in terms of encouraging a more aggressive surplus, gaining some weight?
Exactly. Yeah, you got it. Because, I remember, and we did have some evidence, that kind of showed, what? Gaintaining is good, just kind of maintaining your weight, gaining strength in the gym, slow and steady kind of wins the race, and et cetera. And I that was kind of how I guided athletes for a really long time. And it's probably only been just here as of late, just kind of seeing kind of the stuff that you guys have been putting out. It's like, I probably need to kind of do a 180 on that and be a little bit more aggressive.
Well, it's a funny thing. I think that balance of how quickly you gain, how high do you let body fat get in the off season, it's a product not only of science, because there is good data to suggest, you can put on lean body mass without being in a, big surplus. That's still true,
Mm-hmm.
But it also comes down to how that interacts with the demands of our sport. And I remember, and this isn't throwing shade at anyone, because I think these are accurate observations, but, Dr. Joe saying, hey, when I can get people to start, 15 pounds over, and I can, limit them, their amount of body fat they gain in the off season, and we're talking like 2008, 2009, I remember him saying this and talking about it, there's a much better chance that they're going to get in good shape, and that we're not going to hit big plateaus, and that I'll be able to get them into truly shredded condition. Like, that's still true. But I think it's important to remember that, Dr. Joe in that context is talking to other competitive bodybuilders. He's working primarily with pros. And, that might be true within one season. But I can tell, this is something we've all talked about before, that when we do restrict that off-season weight, it kind of leaves you in this mentally stressed position in most cases, where you have to be careful all the time. And it puts probably some cap on what you can gain, at least anecdotally, in the off season. It's difficult to go through that kind of reverse diet process or slowly control that weight gain. And it also keeps you focused. I think the psychological side of it is probably the bigger issue to me. It keeps you focused on what you look like in a time period when you're only going to be looking worse. Like you might be putting on, we're talking about trained lifters. We're talking about competitors. Like you're only going to be putting on, let's say best case scenario, in my opinion, a pound of muscle for every 4 to 5 pounds of fat you put on. So, being 10 pounds over is always going to look better than being...
That's being generous.
Very generous, yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Is going to look better than being 15 pounds over, even if you manage to put on another pound of muscle, So, yeah, I think it's a tough one. You pretty much don't look better in the off season. The way we always get around it, and Jeff, I know you talk about this all the time because you have you have the longest term perspective out of all of us as competitors. You go like, hey, last time I was at X body weight, I didn't look this full, or I didn't have this kind of separation. It's very different than like when you're early on and you can compare yourself to months ago, So yeah, I would love to hear your perspective on that, with kind of how you think about this long term, and how do you gauge progress and not be too focused on it, and not let yourself get down, because it's so wholly different than what we expect to see when we think me as a bodybuilder.
I think I learned a lot through Alberto. Basically, he kind of just says that we're probably going to see our best gains when we don't necessarily look our best. And that's kind of rang true for me as an athlete. Usually when I try to keep myself a little on the leaner side of things, training seems to struggle a little bit more. Recovery struggles a little bit more. I seem to be more prone to the aches and pains and things like that. And there's like a lot of self-imposed pressure, trying to stay lean as far as like my quality of life, because I have to, in a sense, be a little more rigid with diet and things like that. So I think from a practical standpoint, sometimes it's just not very conducive for myself, and also with other athletes that I've worked with, to try to keep them on the leaner side of things, to, let's say, hey, we got a show next year, let's try to keep you 15 pounds over or what have you. Sometimes it's better to allow them to, let the body weight creep up a little bit, because a lot of that self-imposed stress gets dissipated. Mm-hmm. And I'd rather have an athlete work with less stress, or less stressful environment, just because I know the overall stress is going to be lower. Therefore, performance might be a little bit more elevated. Recovery might be a little bit better. And just the sense of enjoyment will probably be a little bit better as well. So I tend to look at like the stuff that you guys put out, like mass and the research and all that. And you always try to find ways like, how can I incorporate this? But at the same time, I think personally as a coach, I take precedence of like the practicality side of things, the quality of life side of things, and try to mesh the worlds as best as I can.
As you should. And, I'm glad you brought up Alberto, because I think he was probably the first one of us to have essentially periodized that practical, psychological, emotional element of it. So while Alberto has said and does maintain that, when you make your best gains, it's probably going to be after multiple years of not liking the way you look, and trying to find a way to regulate that and be okay with it and still be happy and not stressed. He will also ensure that when it does come down to diet, you are about 10, 15, 20 pounds over. And he has a whole periodization model based on this, to where the time point before you actually start your diet, he's working on the behaviors and the emotional stability to be able to be at a maintenance state at a slightly leaner body weight. And if you've ever seen any of his presentations or him talk about it on Instagram, this is something we all do. We think about, okay, how high should I let my body weight float is tied to when is my next competition. So if you're going to be competing in back-to-back seasons, which we almost never recommend, but sometimes that needs to happen for an individual, like, competing as a pro after getting their pro card, then yeah, you might only be that 15 pounds over, as kind of a random example. But if you're taking a multi-year off season, it could be twice that. And of course, it's going to be adjusted to the individual, their needs, their genetics, and primarily their psychology and eating behavior. So I think Berto, his kind of system is a great example of how all the things that we've talked about are true. Yes, you can make good progress while eating in a very small surplus. Gaintaining is a thing. But is it the best psychologically? Well, that depends on how far you out from your competition, because it's not great psychologically having 6 months to lose 40 pounds either, So how do we periodize that reality? And it's a very, very pragmatic and practical approach that is sensitive to behavioral psychology and societal pressures and just the realities of how hard it is to do what we do with any kind of regularity. So well said, Jeff.
It's kind of like the analogy I like to use is a dimmer switch. Like there's times when you got to turn that light all the way up, full on contest prep, right? Like everything's hyper focused. I need that light to be super high. But there's moments where you turn it down. So on a grand scale it would be like, okay, I'm in my off season. I got 2 years for the next show. Well, I don't need to be, as rigid with things. I can back things off. So if my body fat level does creep up a little bit, well, I still have time to fix that or to have a phase to clean things up before I actually start the prep. And that's where Berto's big picture game planning comes into play. Strategically, I think we've talked about in this podcast where it's like a 2-year game plan of like having an off season, then a prep, then coming out of prep, then back to an off season. So the body fat level is gonna be basically be up and down through those phases, and the amount of rigidness that needs to be applied, it's going to be based off of kind of where you're at within that structure or within that 2-year confine. So yeah. I think, it just kind of just depends. But I like to, even on an acute scale, I kind of just assess things like, where am I at in the process? It could be as simple as like, oh shit, I'm out to eat. It's in the off season. Can I have 3 slices of pizza here? Yeah. Am I going to track it? Probably not. So, okay, dimmer switches down a little bit. Whereas, if I'm, trying to stay a little bit tighter for a show or whatever, then yeah, I'm going to be a little more on top of things and maybe eat 2 pieces of pizza, or, hey, let's not have pizza at all and let's have something else. So it just kind of depends on the context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's a great segue into just, us dealing with humans, and emotions and wants and desires, because we always have with that dimmer switch, we also have to kind of think about the client and the athlete's goals as well, because you kind of have 2 opposite ends of the spectrum in a way. You got 0 miles an hour and you got 65 miles an hour, or you got gaining a lot of weight or you got gaining no weight. We've got our ideas of what we feel the athlete should do, but at the same time, we have to know that they're ultimately the boss, and we have to kind of barter with athletes sometimes and say, you know what, this is the time that we need to be putting on body weight, and the client will be reluctant to do that for whatever reason, like Eric was saying, societal pressures, social media, maybe it's their business, what have you. So we always have to kind of go back and forth. Okay, here's what would be ideal in the big picture of the next time that you're on the stage or the next time you're on the platform, or, whatever the case may be. But yeah, maybe we do have to dial that dimmer switch down and not gain 2 pounds a month. Maybe we only gain a pound, I don't know, every other month, just some sort of a slower rate of gain, or if it's competition prep, we're a long ways out from competition, and we're going to have to turn that dimmer switch full on. You're going to have to count every single macro. You're going to have to, weigh every single gram. And that's maybe something that you want to do right now, but let's just dial that back a little bit. Maybe we'll just use measuring cups and count calories only right now. Maybe we'll just kind of ballpark things a little bit more and save that tool, for when we need to pull it out of a toolbox. Because ultimately that's what it boils down to. We've got all these practical numbers and these ideal scenarios, but we are dealing with humans, and we have to kind of use that evidence and kind of what we know is best, and mold it and customize it for, our athlete, who's kind of our boss in a way.
Brad, that's actually a perfect segue to what I think we probably need to spend a lot of time focusing on, is that you talked about bartering, which means that there is probably an understandable on paper optimal approach, but it always does have to be constrained to the realities in front of us and made practical. Sometimes that's purely logistical. What does your lifestyle allow? How many days a week can you train at the gym? How optimal can your training be? Then how far should we push this? Or what's our timeline? When do you need to compete as a pro after just getting your pro card? Sometimes, not a lot of quote unquote psychology enters that. But I think much of the time, especially on this topic, which interacts with someone's body image and their relationship with food, the bartering comes down to, all right, well, how do we both do what's needed for our sport, but also protect this person's psychology and not put them in a position where they're going to be more stressed, and we end up throwing out the quote unquote optimal baby with the bathwater. You know, we do what's right, and they white knuckle it to do what's right on paper, but it comes with a ton of psychological stress, a poor body image, and they hate the process. You know, they gain 10 pounds, but every step of the way, they're getting more and more depressed. And I think that is the far more challenging thing. You know, we know probably where we want to be as coaches, but we don't necessarily have the ability to. We don't have the tools or the scope of practice to help someone with who is really struggling psychologically. And while unfortunately she's not on this podcast, but we're very fortunate that we have her. We have Amanda Rizzo, who is our mental health consultant. And she wrote an excellent article that I think is relevant to this conversation that just came out. I guess it'll have been maybe a week or two before this podcast comes out, or 4 weeks or something like that. 4 days. I don't know. It's out there. Check out our blog. It's about having a positive body image. What does it mean, and how do you cultivate it? And I have, in my experience, a positive body image is something that competitors, they really struggle with the concept, because our whole goal is to improve our physiques. From a competitive perspective, we're getting judged, and we are comparing ourselves to others by definition of the sport. And we can mitigate that to whatever degree is necessary to survive the competitive pressures of the sport. You know, it's just you versus you. But even then, you're still trying to bring up weak points. You're trying to improve your physique. And I think when you hear the language that comes from like positive psychology and a positive body image, and you hear, you know, your body's perfect, it does exactly what it needs to be, and you need to have unconditional positive regard for yourself, they seem very incongruent. And immediately the logical part of your brain goes, that's not for me. Like, what do we say? We're handing out, you know, participation trophies for everyone in bodybuilding now, you know? and I think it requires a little bit of reframing to understand what it means. And so sometimes it's just a matter of reframing that, okay, your desire to improve doesn't necessarily have to be fueled by a dislike for what you are or a feeling of unworthiness, and it doesn't have to be tied to necessarily your self-worth. It can be this kind of external focus, like just like an athlete who is, let's say they're a pitcher, and they're trying to get into, you know, Major League Baseball, and they haven't yet thrown a 90-mile-per-hour fastball. They want to throw a 90-mile-per-hour fastball. It doesn't mean they can't acknowledge that they're a great AA or AAA pitcher, right? And there's research on this that athletes who don't have a negative self-perception can be still motivated to improve. Like, you don't have to be like never satisfied. There's actually data on this in athletes. And the athletes who are never satisfied and have a fear of self-compassion are actually more distressed, but they're not necessarily higher level athletes. So high level athletes with sustainable careers are able to have an objective as is possible, or at least a non-negative view of their current level of development while still having a perfectionist attitude towards improving. But it's an approach goal. It's not an avoidance goal. It's not, I want to be less shitty. It's, I want to be better. And I think that's a very important framing. And I notice, you know, Andrea was joking as we talked about this topic before we got on air, that we can hear the self-talk in the way our athletes, you know, do our reports and record themselves. And some things they say are kind of like red flags to us. Like, oh, I'm fat. It's like, well, are you really? You know, like, or are you just 15 over? And does that mean that you feel uncomfortable taking off your shirt when you go to the beach when you're not in stage condition? How much of your competition physique is bleeding into your self-perception? And do you have that ability to separate them? And I think sometimes it's just a matter of needing to reframe it and reminding yourself that they are separate. But I think a lot of the times, and the research bears this out as well, a lot of people who have a history of disordered eating or full-blown eating disorders or body image issues are drawn to our sport. And I think sometimes, and I've definitely seen this, it's not just a matter of reframing, it's that you've folded in those negative body image and negative perceptions of your body and unhealthy relationships with food into the competitive format. So it's, I don't like my body, and now I have a reason to improve it as I compete. So then when I have to see my body getting worse, it's a much bigger emotional cost to me than it might be if it was just about putting on muscle and accepting some fat gain. So I think that's something that I would just ask every listener to evaluate is, are you improving because you are excited about improving in your sport, or are you trying to fix things you don't like about your body? And it would be that way with or without bodybuilding. So anyway, tough question to ask, but an important one. And I think, especially if you have an initial knee-jerk negative reaction to the concept of having a positive body image and it being conflicting to your sport and not being able to square that circle, I think that's an especially important thread to pull until you get back to the source.
Yeah, that reminds me of something that happened with my son, talking about improvement specifically, back when he was in grade school. One of the reasons that we took Xander out of school for a while is because he would make dramatic improvements that the teacher wouldn't recognize. You know, like for example, and he was always terrible in math, and he would be getting like 34%. On tests. And then he gradually was getting like, 58%. And the teacher basically only saw that that's still an F, and especially, with me being such a data-driven person, I'm like, look, okay, yeah, sure, it's still an F, but he just doubled his score, in the matter of weeks here. He went from like 35% to 58%. Can you not, kind of understand that? And then, of course, I'm showing Xander this because he's still listening to the teacher, and the teacher's saying that you still have an F. And I'm like, look at these numbers, son. Let's put this in football terms. Would you rather have 38 points or would you rather have 58 points, And it wasn't until we put him back in school and actually got him in front of a teacher that was like, look at his improvement here. He's gone not only from like an F to a C, but he's gone from like 40% to 70%. And I think sometimes competitors are kind of like that old school teacher that is looking at the scale of an F versus an F versus something that's 30% versus something that's 50%. And we're all our own worst critics, but at the same time, we have to kind of put that lens on and understand there really truly is improvement, Or like you said, Eric, it's like, are you really fat, or are you looking through a lens that an F is an F and not that, you need to be looking at yourself as your only competition and not that competitive outlet that you're seeing on the bodybuilding stage.
I was going to say, it's like usually when we're feeling probably our worst about ourselves is when we are in the off season, right? It's usually when we're like get to extreme levels of body fat, 7%, 6%. That's where we look the best on stage. But in the real world, that is not considered normal. Like that's an extreme look. It's something that we can't hold all the time. But once you attain that almost becomes now the expectation. And that's what you're going to judge yourself off of thereafter. So when you come off of the stage and you start to accumulate body fat, you start to look worse, very acutely. Like every week you're like, oh crap, I look worse. Next week, I look worse. So because you're comparing yourself to that extreme state, that cool state you're in, because it looks cool. Don't get me wrong. I love looking like that, but it's just not reasonable. And it's hard to accept the fact that you're going to start going the other way. And that's where a lot of us have a harder time. And I think that's where the basis of this podcast is coming from, is how do we accept that look, that softer look, which I think a lot of us that have trained a while and we're experienced, and if we've gone through a contest prep or two, we know that environment needs to be there, like having more body fat, again, for the performance aspect, the recovery, pliability, lower stress levels. Like we know it's where we need to be, but it's just hard to get up in the morning, look in the mirror and go, oh crap, I don't look the way I want to look right now. So for me personally, like I've struggled with this over the years, and I think I struggled with the most probably after 2014, 15, 16, because I just remember at that time, being that I was, in my early 40s, okay, I have to have this standard. Like if I'm going to be competing every year or every other year, I need to hold that 10 pounds over stage weights to make my preps easier. And I held 10 pounds for quite a while, and I realized that, yeah, it looks great, but everything outside of that, like, yeah, it looks great when I'm training, it looks great when I'm going to jump in the shower. It's all cool and everything. But the other 23 hours of the day, I'm food focused. I'm hungry. My performance was struggling a little bit. Recovery was harder to come by. And what really kind of just totally sold me on like, I need to put some more weight on. It was like, I went on a cruise with my family. And for the first 4 days out of the cruise, I'm food focused and really trying to watch what I'm eating on this cruise. Like here's this life event. And I'm so focused on bodybuilding that I was too fearful to just enjoy myself and have a dessert here or there. And on the 5th day, I'm like, excuse my French. I'm like, F this. This is stupid. This is silly. So I'm going to eat whatever I want. And I basically just allowed myself to enjoy. And it was like a weight lifted off my shoulder. And then when I got back home, I allowed about 2 or 3 pounds to come on over the next week or two, whatever it was. And instantly I felt way better. And I just realized, okay, 10 pounds isn't ideal for me. Yeah, it looks cool. Yeah, I might get more likes on the Instagrams and I get more oohs and ahs and Jeff, you look great. But it really wasn't worth just the way I was feeling. So I knew right then and there, like, okay, I probably need to be 20, 25 pounds over stage weight. Yeah, it's a softer look. But I've learned to embrace it, over the last 5, 6, 7 years. And right now I'm about 25 over probably. And the look doesn't bother me at all. Like I think I would still be a little hesitant about, going to the beach and maybe pulling that shirt off. But I also know in the real world, like 25 over stage weight looks probably better than majority of the population. And I'm not trying to be arrogant about it. It's just reality. And this is what I tell some of my other athletes that are like worried about, like if they're going on vacation and they're worried about, their off season look. I want to look more lean when I'm on the beach. It's like, look around. You see everybody else, every other regular guy out there and gal on the beach, and they're in their bikinis and they're enjoying life and they're not worried about who's looking at them or whatever. So it's for me, I just realized like going through that experience that, okay, I just need to embrace the look I have now because 20 to 25 over for me is a normal look and it's where I perform the best. It's where I recover really well and I can do the life thing really well too. So, and I think we can all agree that when performance is really elevated and you're consistent with that performance, usually the progress kind of just follows that organically. So I've learned to kind of relax through my processes as well. And it's helped me to enjoy just the journey itself that much more.
Really quick favor, guys. If you enjoy these shows and have been a listener for quite some time, we would really, really, really appreciate it if you could take the time to give us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever your preferred podcast app may be. Having lots of ratings and audience feedback makes our show become more visible across multiple platforms, and it supports our mission of helping as many people as we can to be the best athletes, coaches, and lifting enthusiasts that they could possibly be. So if you're not driving and wouldn't be dangerous, pause this thing right now and give us an honest review over on your podcast app, and we would love you even more than we already do. Thanks for taking the time, and we hope you enjoy the show.
I remember those years, Jeff, when you were trying to hold that 10 pounds over stage weight. And just to add to, the societal pressure, I remember vividly just encouraging you, saying, yeah, I keep 10 pounds overweight. You can do it. Yeah, it'll be a little bit tough, but you can do it. You're Jeff Alberts. You're the Godfather. I added to that, and I think back to it now, and I'm like, I feel like I almost have to apologize to you because I was almost like enabling you in a way. You know what I mean? It's like those codependent, drug addicts that you see on interventions and stuff like that. I need to hold up this image of myself, and I'm like, yeah, you need to do that, Jeff. You go.
Well, I mean, like if we take it even further, just to not to talk about myself the whole time, but if we take it like look at an even bigger picture, like I spun my wheels, right, trying to hold this arbitrary number, trying to stay too lean, suffered through it. And then I came out of it, gained about 10, 15 more pounds, went up. And there was a short period of time, though. Then I was back into contest prep mode. So in a sense, that kind of sabotaged that off season. Because I know personally, I usually thrive better with performance and all that when I'm a little heavier. And then when I got into the next contest prep, it was not very great. It was failed. I didn't even finish it out. And it was almost since like a 2 or 3 year period where I was kind of just in this vicious cycle of not having like a full commitment to one thing. It was like I was kind of waffling in between two. Should I, the old saying with the old question with everybody, should I bulk, should I cut? Like I was just in this little cycle of going back and forth. And I would say like right now, I feel very excited about the decision I just made to not finish out a prep, but to just commit myself to a more of a longer term off season. Cause I don't think I've had a legit off season like the last 5 years. Cause I've been doing, too many contest preps and not enough off season time. And in 2018, when I failed that prep, I only had like a 6-month rebound where I was able to pick up some body weight and then I dove back into a prep again. And although I did extremely well in 2019, it was just now looking in hindsight, like, just the fact that since November of 2019 up until this point, I've been 20 plus over my stage weight the entire time. And I think that's why I'm looking the way I'm looking right now. Like I'm definitely looking fuller. I don't know if I'm the biggest I've ever been, but for the last 5 years, I think I've duplicated where I was when I had that successful year in 2014. So I think it's just when you think about like, you have to think big picture. I think sometimes we just get caught up in the moment. Like, oh, I want to be lean. I want to be lean. I don't want to get too far out of shape or whatever. Sometimes we're just making these little decisions in the moment, these emotional decisions that really takes us away from, what's more conducive as far as the big picture.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, what you were saying earlier, how your performance is better, you feel better, your life is better. You're kind of describing, and again, this isn't my area. So, if any psychologists are listening and I don't get this quite right, I'm trying. But from what I've seen in some of the counseling techniques in coaching people who have body image disorders or are struggling with a negative body image, they have a very one-dimensional way of looking at their body. It's how does it look? And when it doesn't look right, that's one and only one opportunity to be happy about it, and then it's lost. So one of the things that's often encouraged is being grateful for and focusing on all the cool shit our bodies do, like the housing our organs that allow us to stay alive, to experience life, enabling us to move and to have whatever degree of health each one of us is blessed to have, And I think bodybuilders are generally some of the healthiest people around, in terms of just their physical capabilities, like musculoskeletal health, There are a lot of people with back injuries that don't just hurt them on 400-pound deadlifts, that prevent them from moving and doing, general tasks in life. And I think something we've always kind of been about since the very beginning, and why we have so many dual sport athletes in kind of the greater 3DMJ community, is focusing on progressive overload. And not just because that's actually how you build muscle and how you ensure that you do make progress in the off season, but also instead of focusing on the muscle pump or how sore you get after workouts, or really just focusing on, like the changes in your physique in the off season, which again are typically just worse. We encourage people to focus on the logbook, focus on performance, and treating their lifts like a skill, and you don't just have to be a powerlifter to do this. I mean, just look at Jeff. Like, he has some of the most immaculate and consistent form. He focuses on progression. He trains in multiple rep ranges, and he thinks about performance a lot. But certainly, I think, powerlifting is a great vehicle for that. And that's been a huge part of, kind of the way we operate. And I think what we focus on when I coach athletes, I'm very intentionally trying to get them to stop focusing on their body and start focusing on other things, and teaching them how to feel again, instead of just being solely focused on what they look like. And that's not an accident. And I think we've all experienced that when we're able to shift our focus to the weight room instead of the kitchen or bathroom mirror or, the videos we take, the off season becomes much more palatable. And really we get to this, as Andrea put it in, I think our 2016 overseas presentation, we accept a certain level of insanity during prep, where we are going, all right, I'm going to look at my body primarily just as a living piece of art, and that it's my happiness and my competitive success will be dictated on what I look like on this game day, and that's what I'm focused on, which is essentially the exact opposite of what that counseling advice is for someone who's dealing with, a negative body image. So we have to repair that. because you do need to focus on that during contest prep to some degree. You do want to do weekly check-ins and see if your posing's improved, to see if you got more cuts, to see if you're maintaining your size, and because that's our sport. But our sport is absolutely not our lives. So I think really understanding how to turn that card around and start being able to have gratitude and appreciation for all the other amazing things that our body does. Last time I checked, I don't have to think to breathe. I just sit here freaking processing oxygen and breathing out and breathing in, staying alive. And that's pretty neat, you know? So like our bodies are pretty complex, cool things. And then maybe that's the scientist in me speaking, but I think being able to appreciate that rather than just, you know, how much does your adipose tissue obscure your muscles is probably a more dynamic, complete way to have perspective and reframing of the body.
I can relate that. Even like with the numbers, like even training, like 'cause sometimes we get caught up in trying to improve the numbers so much that, you know, we have to remember that we're still moving weight. And that's what I appreciate with my training is like, man, even if it's a shitty ass workout, like there's people out there that don't even have the opportunity to do that. And I just kind of remind myself, okay, the only way I'm going to regress or I'm going to see atrophy is if I don't train at all. So I'm still training and I still have intent behind my training. So as long as I have the intensity there, numbers aren't going to matter that much. I'm still going to get a stimulus to some degree and I ain't going to go backwards because of it. So I think sometimes we have a lot of self-imposed stress when we focus on these things. And I think focusing on body fat percentages too, like the numbers, don't always define and dictate happiness. Because I know like you can be 10% body fat, but you still might not like the way you're looking. And I know everybody wants to chase that arbitrary 10% body fat, like they think that's going to be happiness, but it doesn't always equate to that. So sometimes, like for me, for instance, like trying to be 10 over, you know, that just wasn't working. So, hey, I had to be a little softer and that was my happy place. But I had to learn to love that higher body fat percentage. And I started to weigh out the pros and cons. And I started, it wasn't like an overnight thing, like, okay, here's all the pros to being heavier. It was like a gradual process that I had to experience. But by going through it, the more I went through it, the more acceptance I got to it because I could see, you know, all the positives that were coming out of it. Yeah.
And I feel like one of our big jobs as coaches is to, it's to recognize not even big wins, small wins, you know, it's to recognize accomplishments, you know, that a lot of times even your most seasoned athlete might not recognize, you know, and I don't know where I want to go with this, but it just a lot of times athletes, especially those that are real hard on themselves, they fail to recognize those wins and those accomplishments. And even of the simplest of things, you know, like someone might be very used to the loads that they're lifting, but that's all they're focused on is kind of like what they're doing and then what the best in the world are doing. And then they fail to realize, you know what, you're really freaking strong. You know, if you wanted to do a powerlifting meet as a bodybuilder, you would do pretty darn well, you know, and you need to recognize that you're like stronger than most of the people that are at your gym, I would be willing to bet. And kind of the same thing with the quote unquote fat bodybuilder, you know, that just only has seen themselves or really only looks at themselves, I guess, as the lean competitor on stage. It's like, look at you right now. You know, you've got better muscle definition than probably most people at your gym, and yet you're huge. You know, you gotta kind of fail to realize that the amount of muscle that you have, it lends itself to being a little bit fatter, because you literally look like a giant human, you know, and you need to recognize those kinds of things, that you have more muscle and you can carry around more body mass, regardless of what percentage of it is fat versus muscle, you know. And I feel like it's really important that not only that we recognize those kind of things, but then also kind of nurture and almost kind of like be the cheerleader, you know, of the client kind of in the background. It's like, look at what you've accomplished here, you know. Yeah, you know, okay, you know, you're not as cut as you were, but at the same time, look at how much weight you're moving, you know, and vice versa. You know, it's kind of like, you know what, okay, you know what, you're not moving as much weight as you normally do, but look at how good your body looks, you know, and we can kind of almost like politicians, you know, we can kind of spin things to sound better than they really, you know, might not look otherwise. But a lot of times there's still a lot of truth to that, you know. But I feel like that's an important part of a coach's job, is to just recognize wins like that. And then, you know, like I said, you know, kind of nurture them. And I think sometimes people that just bury their head in their own, I mean, it's not a bad thing that you just kind of work in the dark and you bury your head in your own program and recognize your own wins. But sometimes you kind of miss out on that other perspective that maybe you don't even realize is a win.
Yeah, you've only got your own voice in those scenarios, Brad. And I think if we're talking about people who tend to have a very singular focus, and Jeff, I'm glad that you said, hey, it doesn't just have to be your body fat. Like, there's a ton of powerlifting and strength athletes who get super focused on their big three, and they can get really burnt out. We see it all the time. You go to any powerlifting podcast, talk to 4 powerlifters, and they talk about when they got too focused on hitting PRs and fell out of love with the sport, you know? So it's really having blinders on. And I think if you have blinders on and you're focused just on one thing, and in this case, what do I look like? But it could apply to your big three or whatever for our non-competitive bodybuilders who are listening. It robs you of a lot of opportunities to have gratitude and to have appreciation. So, Brad, I love that you said, you know, the coach's job is to potentially give them a few other voices, you know, because the way we see ourselves is expressed in our self-talk, right? So if you've got blinders on and you're only looking at one thing and you have no other opportunities to have gratitude, especially if you have a slightly negative view and you're motivated by not feeling good enough, your self-talk is going to reflect that. It's going to be, okay, fatty, it's time to get to the gym. It's going to be, you know, insert whatever makes sense for you, or what are things that, I'm not good enough, some version of that, basically. And you become super myopically focused, and your self-talk is very, very singular and negative. So being a cheerleader, yeah, I mean, I think viewing it purely as, it's not my job to be a cheerleader, like it's not my job to motivate my clients. I hate when I hear coaches say that, because sometimes we're dealing with people who don't have positive self-talk. So we get the opportunity to model that, to give them the few voices that might actually give them additional perspectives and new opportunities to reframe them. They weren't even thinking about how well they move, or what it's like to be healthy, or the fact that they look great in a shirt now, while before, if they took off their shirt, they looked shredded, but everyone, when you had your shirt on, didn't even know you lift. And that's you know, a very common experience we can all laugh about as natural bodybuilders when we diet down. So yeah, just having all these other opportunities for a coach to help you recognize the small wins, the small progress that you wouldn't think of, may not be much for someone who is well balanced. But if someone is really struggling with having those blinders on, having a solitary negative voice, that might be the only opportunity they get to hear a positive voice. And hopefully, one day, with continued intent, those words might actually come internally, which is eventually where we want to get to, because that's when it has much more power. So that's well said, Brad.
I think too, probably the pressure because social media pressure of trying to stay lean for either, hey, I'm trying to drive business for myself, or I'm trying to follow in the footsteps of some popular influencer or something like that. Or, you know, hey, now they're saying, you know, because of the P ratio thing, I need to follow this thing and that. So there's a lot of pressure, I think, that comes with all
Jeff,
that.
P ratios are canceled. We've already established that. So don't worry. That's done.
You know me, I don't even bother initiating into any of those debates, because like I said earlier in the podcast, I gravitate more towards the practicality side of things, because I know when people follow more practicality as far as protocols, there's better chance and more likelihood of more long-term sustainable progress. Because usually if we're doing these black or white things, like we're either hardcore or, you know, it's either an on-off switch, fizzle out. And I mean, we've seen it time and time again. You know, it's very rare you see someone raise my hand doing this 35 years later on a high level. And it's not because I've been so fixated on trying to be super optimal according to, you know, X, Y, and Z. I've kind of had to learn how to self-master. And like I said, through a trial and error process of going through the ups and downs of trying to stay lean or getting too heavy or what have you, I've found a nice middle ground for me. But it took trial and error. But I think, that's what I do as a coach is like, I try to really just dive into people's backgrounds and see what makes them tick and see what, protocols may or may not work for them. And it might take time to figure out, hey, this person operates better at 15% body fat, or hey, this person might do better at 20. Or even, hey, they can do 10% and they feel fine and they perform, like you said, they maintain, they do very well there. So I just think you have to get to know your athletes, and you have to have communication and conversation with them. And, the last thing that I want to do is say, hey, here's the latest research and science, and now I'm going to throw it down your throat, and not really take into consideration, any other context outside of that. So it might have been a little bit of a rant here, but yeah, I don't like to get into the debates of the P ratio or the refeed thing or any of that stuff, right?
Well, and that's...
Go ahead, Brad.
I was just going to say that your rant is a lot of times perfectly summed up in a quote that I remember vividly that I'm probably going to screw up from our good Dr. Zerdos, in that, we as practitioners use the evidence, like P ratios and whether or not it's true or false and all the evidence and whatnot, to kind of create and customize programs for our athletes. So we're basically practitioners. We're using that evidence, but at the same time, like I said before, we're dealing with humans, and we have to almost like pick and choose what it is that we're using, so that we do get all of the context in place, so that we can build what's going to work well, for the athlete, client, etc.
Yep.
Wish I could remember that quote, because that is a great quote, but I always screw it up. I just remember the practitioner part.
Yeah, I mean, Zerdos will always explain that that science is meant to be conceptual and integrated. That's typically his keywords.
Yes.
If anyone has been in his any courses he's done or talked to him about this, and that is the opposite of being black and white. It is, we figured this thing out. How do you? What is the concept behind that, and how do we integrate that as practitioners into your situation? So I think that's very apt, Brad, that you brought that up. So thank you. And yeah, science isn't meant to be a big stick. Applied research or translational research is supposed to be applied. It's supposed to be translated into practice, which means not directly copy pasted on top of your face and stapled to your forehead, but literally translated into your situation. So, what does that look like in the context?
My Halloween costume. I'm going to put a stamp of science on my forehead.
I love it. Science approved. Yeah, I like it. I like it. I don't know what that Halloween costume is exactly, but you got 6 months. We can workshop it. It's all good.
I'm an evidence-based bodybuilder, basically.
There you go. I like it. You might have to lose some more mass before you fit that mold. Shots across my own bow. You like that?
I better start dieting and get to a leaner body weight now.
That's right.
More pressure. Yeah. Thanks, Eric.
Exactly. You gotta. If science doesn't mess you up and give you an eating disorder, is it science anyway? So no. But in all seriousness, if that's just not the way science is supposed to be, right? So science, when it comes down to the point where it actually touches the ground and it is translated into the real world, needs to look wholly different. It retains the concept, but it needs to be integrated into the situation of the individual. And if the science is a one-size-fits-all, or it doesn't have any ability to be translated, it has no utility to the practitioner. And, that's why I do what I do. So, yeah, that's well said. Yeah, I think it's worth saying just how prevalent body image issues and eating disorders are in competitive bodybuilders. I was motivated to write a review on this topic with Jake Leonard and Katerina Pernjak, who are experts in this area more than I am. I'm just pretty familiar with the bodybuilding literature. And it's striking to me how many people come from a background of having disordered eating or body image issues of some type. And it may be as high as like a third. When you think about that, that's pretty crazy. And that's like averaging males and females. It's probably higher among women based on the data we have, which isn't great, but it's the data we got. So I think it really behooves you, even if you're like most bodybuilders, not most, many bodybuilders are also coaches and work with others. So even if you're someone who has struggled with this, but more from the perspective of, oh, I lost my perspective on what it was before I got into competing and I had to kind of recenter myself and reframe it and I'm good to go. Remember that there may be many of your athletes who have that on top of the fact that they used to have an eating disorder or used to have some very serious body image concerns, which typically go hand in hand. So I think you really do need to consider, it's, in my opinion, it is a disservice and a dereliction of duty as a practitioner to think of only giving people what's optimal and letting them sort out the psychology on their own. I think you have to consider it. And I think it needs to be a priority, an order of priority higher than, what is optimal on paper. It's not, here's what's optimal, figure it out. It's, let's talk about where we're trying to get to, where you're at now, what are our barriers, and how can we work together to get there? And doing so in a way that's all the things we talked about, encouraging the development of new self-talk, giving them opportunities for wins that aren't, myopic and on a singular, potentially negative voice, and making sure you're doing a lot of checking in, a lot of asking a lot of questions, or you can really find yourself leading someone into a dark place, which I think is something we've unfortunately all experienced at one time or another in the sport. But I know we would all like to minimize that as much as possible for anyone who's coming into it.
Yeah, I know that sometimes the most gratifying wins as a coach are a lot of times have nothing to do with physique or lifting. Whenever you can kind of let somebody see the light that, I don't really have to track my macros. I can just kind of eat intuitively and pay attention to my fullness levels and make sure I'm eating, like an adult, and I'm eating a vegetable every now and then. And as Andrea loves to say, don't eat like an asshole, because sometimes I think those kind of wins are overlooked. When someone can just put that bag of bricks down and just eat and enjoy their training and maybe even not even really focus on their body weight anymore, and they can like almost kind of take that scale and, oh, look how dusty it's getting. I think I'm just going to put that in the linen closet, for a little while. And, like Berto said, the sun still comes up. We didn't have to sacrifice a chicken and 3 goats to get the sun to come up. It's going to come up anyway. They kind of, when they see the light and it's like, oh, look at, I'm looking pretty darn good. And I haven't weighed myself in 3 months, and I haven't counted a calorie in 4 months, that to me sometimes is almost more gratifying than, that elite total or that bodybuilding pro card or win or class win or what have you, and those are things that I think that sometimes need to be encouraged and congratulated more so because those things are sometimes 10 times harder to overcome, especially when we're not necessarily qualified to make those kind of things happen. But yet I think that we're on the right track if they do happen,
I often think of my goal with every competitor I work with is not necessarily to have them win. Of course, it is, especially if that's their goal or improve their total or all those objective things. It's to allow them to compete in their sport on their terms. Because there's so many athletes I've worked with, and I can think of one who, the proudest moment, the aha moment with this particular athlete, after working with this person in their first season, watching them get their pro card, watching them win their first pro show, the next one, and then watching them place top 3 at Worlds in the next one, was to finally take an extended off season and then never come back to the sport, which thus far, and I had zero problem with that. I didn't feel like, oh man, like we lost one. Like they worked with me for 3 years and then they quit bodybuilding. Damn it. Like it was that entire time, those contest preps were almost a response to really being miserable in the off season and not knowing how to deal with on being unhappy with this person's body. So their decision to compete wasn't fully theirs. It was, they were kind of a slave to the sport in some ways, not to be too hyperbolic about it, but they weren't fully in the driver's seat. They felt obligated to compete again. And while, good things happened and, they can look back and remember that they they were, you know, a pro champion and all that stuff and got a pro card and they were one of the best bodybuilders in the world at that time. I don't want someone to be there because they feel like they're forced to, you know? So with my goal with every person is for them to figure out a way to feel like they're in the driver's seat most of the time, not the bag of bricks sitting on that accelerator, just driving them into a wall, like you talked about, Brad. Mm-hmm. So that looks very different for every person, but ultimately you can hear it when they have that dissonance. They have that push and that pull. They don't want to bulk, but they don't want to cut. They're too focused on eating, but they don't want to be focused on eating, but they're really hungry. They don't like their body, but they do want to gain muscle, but they want to be lean. And it just pulls them apart internally. And I think we've all experienced it personally. We've seen it with our athletes, and being able to help them find, most of the time, getting to a position where they are able to make decisions, or at least most of the voices in their own head are on the same page, and they can be happy and move forward and feel like their bodybuilding is integrated with their life. That's the goal, more so than any accolade or trophy.
You just described 3D Muscle Journey when we first started it.
Well, that's very nostalgic.
I like that though. Like, we're trying to like have the journey based on how we want it, not based on external sources. Like, to me, that's like the ultimate success. That's where I'm at now. Like, everything I'm doing, I'm kind of just doing it because I like the fun factor, the enjoyment is kind of priority number one. And that's where I was toggling. Should I finish the prep, not finish the prep? And I'm waffling, and I know, okay, if I'm waffling, that means I'm not fully committed. And if I'm not fully committed, there's no way I'm going to be able to do the thing right. So I just made the wise big picture decision. Hey, just go off season, eat more food, enjoy it, be a little fatter, a little happier, train my ass off, and come back when I'm in a better position and more motivated and committed to do an extreme endeavor. Because that's what bodybuilding is. When we go make our way to this stage, it's extreme.
Yep. And you know that when we had that conversation as a group in our last meeting about, you know, essentially helping you to figure out what you wanted, that's really what coaching is. It's holding space for someone to work through all of those pushes and pulls, and to, you know, be honored enough for them to allow you to potentially be a voice that breaks some of those cycles where they don't get anywhere. Because a lot of the times when I get wound up, and it really does feel like this kind of forward accelerating anxiety, I don't have an answer to break out of that push and pull. I'm just like, left, right, and it just goes faster and faster until I'm just, you know, damn near panic attack. And just to be able to have the space where someone I trust and respect, who is helping me achieve my goals, can give me feedback, ask me the right questions at the right time, let me speak out loud and figure out the internal mess that I can't sort through in my own head, is incredibly valuable. So it was cool to have that opportunity, Jeff, and thank you for it, to be able to, you know, give you our feedback and try to help you figure out what you wanted. Because ultimately, you know, if you're a good coach, that's what should make you happy. Not just like trying to get people who can win, but trying to help people figure out what does their journey look like.
Yeah, no, I appreciated all you guys' perspectives. I mean, each one of you guys had a different, unique perspective to offer, and it helped to kind of solidify the decision. And I think that's what coaching is. Like you said earlier, it's like 30% X's and O's, but it's that 70% where you're kind of just offering up perspective, experience, and it just helps to kind of, you know, pave the way forward. And it was more of the big picture stuff that really solidified the decision. And it was like a big weight came off the shoulders. You know, I think I 100% made the decision the next day after just like going over in my head what each of you coaches had to offer. And it all made sense. There wasn't like one perspective where I was like, nah, they're full of shit with that. It was like, you know, it was all valid. And when you look at each one of you guys as coaches, I mean, yeah, there's a ton of experience there. Like, of course, a lot of evidence-based stuff there, but it was more the human element. It was like how everybody had a perspective, how bodybuilding would kind of fit into my life and my lifestyle that really kind of really solidified everything. So like Brad gave me the confidence, like, dude, you're jacked. Like, just like you said earlier, he kind of just like gave me the confidence, that little reassurance, like, okay, yeah, I look good. I look great right now. Keep it going. Don't lose weight. Just keep it going, Jeff. So that was like some fuel, some motivation. And then you, Eric, you're basically saying, hey, you may or may not get bigger. You are older. You may not gain muscle, but at the very least, you're not going to regress. Not all of a sudden you're going to lose muscle overnight. So worst case scenario, you decide to cut next year, the muscle's still going to be there. So that was like reassurance, like, I'm going to be okay if I make this decision to stop prep. And Andrea, she's good at like thinking things through, like, she asking questions. And so basically just reinforce, okay, I really need to take more extra time before I decide on what I'm actually going to do. And then Alberto gave me a very good life perspective, like nothing to do with bodybuilding or contest prep or off-season weight, none of that shit. It was like, dude, you're under a microscope. Your son is watching your every move. And if you go into a prep half-assing it or not fully committed, he's going to see that. And in the real world, when he gets older, he's going to have to earn everything that he's going to get. So is that how you want him, you don't want him to follow you in those footsteps? So I was like, you know what? That makes sense. So if I'm going to do this prep thing, I want to 100%, be committed and put, as much work and hard work as possible so he can model that. So it's, again, coaching is not about, hey, you need to be 15% body fat X 6 months out or whatever. It's like a lot of it is like the human side, the human element. So that I definitely appreciated.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, and I hear that a lot from clients that we consult with, that they feel like a big weight's been lifted off their shoulders. Jeff, exactly what you talked about. They're doing a lot of waffling. Should I cut? Should I bulk? Should I maintain? Should I focus on strength? Should I focus on hypertrophy? And a lot of times when we're done with a session, we end up coming away with the client feeling just like that. Like they've had a weight lifted off their shoulders. And almost regardless of if the decision that we made was right or wrong, or if they changed their mind, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, a year down the road, that period of time that they actually committed to a plan and they committed to executing a plan, that oftentimes leaves a lot of nice clues of good, productive progress. You know what I mean? Because I think that, like you said, Jeff, waffling back and forth a lot of times, I mean, it's obviously not very productive, but we can waste years kind of doing that, and not only do we waste years of potential progress and whatever it is that we were trying to accomplish, but we waste a lot of happiness that could have been yielded from that. That waffling a lot of times, it creates a lot of negative self-talk. It creates a lot of just all of the negative aspects that go along with indecision. And I think that just resonated with me, Jeff, when you said that weight was lifted off your shoulders. Like, regardless of if this is right or wrong, now I've got a plan. Now I'm committing to something.
Yeah. I don't look like the drunk guy trying to go down the line, but I'm not going to the left. I'm going to the right, stumbling, can't even speak right. Now it's like, okay, I'm getting off the highway now. This is where I'm going. So it's just like, it just feels so much better. There's more of a sense of direction. Like you said, there's just a lot more relief. And that weight is lifted off. Like the bodybuilding weight is off my shoulders. Obviously, I'm not like, my real life isn't like bad or anything like that. But just like that bodybuilding life, just having that undecided feeling, it was just, it was starting to get to me. And that's why I kind of brought it up to you guys. And I think what's important too is not as a coach, but on the receiving end, the athlete, is to have an open mind, to be open to people's, or your coach or whoever, their perspectives. Doesn't mean you have to follow. That's why I told Eric, hey, I might not follow your advice, but I definitely want to hear your perspective, because it does help to get me to think about things that maybe some things I might not even be aware of or thinking about. So I think you have to have an open mind as an athlete and be willing to accept advice and really listen to it and think about it. And that's a big step for some people.
It's a huge step. And ultimately, that feeling of the bag of bricks being lifted off is that moment of clarity and decision, you know? And clarity is something that is directly attached to understanding what you want to do, which is directly attached to what are your values and what has meaning to you. And I think that's why, like, when you say I may not follow your advice, I'm like, well, shit, man. I'm not trying to give you advice. I want to help you figure out what you care about. Because if I'm not on target and it doesn't result in that weight getting lifted, then I wasn't able to help you get to that piece of clarity, and we just keep going, you know? And I think that's why this is totally different topic than, you know, body fat and accepting it and body image, all that stuff. And we've gotten a little off in the weeds, but I think it's really, really good. This is why coaching has to be something where there's a relationship developed. Because I can't help you better understand your motivations if I don't know you. And if we're not comfortable enough and we don't have a good enough rapport where you can't communicate that to me and express it to me, then I won't be able to reflect back to you what I think I'm hearing and what I know about you and what your values are. So I think that to tie it into the topic at hand, that's why it's so important. Like, you may tell somebody, hey, here's how high your body fat should get for health and happiness in the off season. And here's what's best on paper. And here's what's best in reality. We need to figure out where you are. That's all fine and good. But if you don't necessarily know why and what is motivating someone to try to stay lean, or what drove them to the sport, or what type of pressures do they have, either social media, personal, significant other, or otherwise, you know, you have no idea what's going on with this person. It's very difficult for those suggestions to land home. So ultimately, that's why coaching is very much about holding that space and helping the person explore their own motivations, because that's all it is. And getting better and better at helping someone figure their own shit out so they aren't getting a DUI with their decision making, like Jeff was talking about. Which, by the way, folks,
I'm not going to tell you what's inside this cup.
Yeah, he didn't hit anybody. It's fine. He's doing his community service. So, yeah. Don't drink while driving.
No.
I think that's pretty good. You guys, anything else you want to leave our listeners with as a final word?
No, not really. I agree with you, though. We did get a kind of a little bit away from our topic that we did have in mind, but I think it almost turned out a little bit better, to be honest with you, because we kind of were talking through a lot of that.
Well, you know, there's flexible dieting. We got flexible podcasting.
That's right. IIFYP. Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed this discussion. I think it was a great dive into what body image is. What does it mean in the context of bodybuilding? The realities and the logistics of putting on body fat and muscle, and what type of perspectives you might need to be in it for the long haul to be successful in the sport. And also, and more importantly, actually want to be successful in the sport, want to keep doing the sport, and actually enjoy the process. So, as always, we appreciate you listening. We hope you took something from this, and we will see you next time.
Hey guys, this is Coach Alberto Nunez. Thanks so much for listening to our show today. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. I wanted to take a moment to remind you guys that we have a giant video library of educational materials at 3dmjvault.com. The vault is a place where we have organized our best information, paired it up with some of our favorite resources, and shared with all of you guys in one online database. We have courses on contest prep, hypertrophy, posing, fat loss, postseason recovery, and a whole lot more. Most of it is free. Some of it is for purchase to help support this podcast, and we continue adding pieces of updated content to it every couple of months that members always have unlimited access to. Once again, that's 3dmjvault.com, and we really hope you like it.